Welcome back to our second part of our lecture on polar bonds and molecules. We'll pick up from the slide where we just left off. Let's do some more examples. If we try hydrogen cyanide, HCN, when we put it together, it looks like this. We know that it's a linear molecule because carbon has a single bond and a triple bond as far from each other as possible and no unshared pairs. Now we have to look up hydrogen, carbon, and nitrogen. Hydrogen has a value of 2.1, carbon 2.5, and nitrogen 3.0. If we draw in our arrows to indicate the polarity of the bonds, we can see that there's a difference of 0.5 between carbon and nitrogen. So we get an arrow of this length. And there's a slightly lower difference, only 0.4. We normally call that pretty much a nonpolar bond, but since there is a slight difference, we can draw a small arrow in here. So we can see both of these arrows point from the hydrogen down towards the nitrogen end of the molecule as a whole, which means we're going to have the hydrogen end slightly positive and the nitrogen end slightly negative. So these do not cancel each other out. They're not equal in measure, nor are they pointing in opposite directions. They don't cancel each other out. They kind of add together to give an overall polarity to the molecule. This is indicated with the blue arrow. So we can label each end of this molecule del positive on the hydrogen end, del negative on the nitrogen end, so we can see, looking from the ends perspective, that we do have a positive end and a negative end, and therefore from that perspective we can also definitely say that this is a polar molecule. Now let's try Ni3. Is it going to be a polar molecule or not? To answer that question, we first have to correctly draw the molecule. Now, just like NH3, this is going to be pyramidal. This time the pyramid's kind of sitting on its side. We have iodines, 3 of them, connected to nitrogen and an unshared pair. So we get this basic pyramidal shape. Now, iodine has a value of 2.5 and nitrogen is 3.0. So we do have a small arrow going from the iodine towards the nitrogen for each of these bonds. We can see that here. Now, these don't all cancel each other out. When we look at it, we can see that each of these iodines are a slightly positive end, and the nitrogen has 3 arrows pointing at it, which makes it a slightly negative end. It is a slightly polar molecule because the iodine end is slightly positive and the nitrogen end is slightly negative, as indicated here. Now what about a molecule of NCl3? We still have nitrogen bound to 3 of something else, this time 3 chlorines, so its structure is going to be similar to what we just saw, but when we look up their electronegativity values, both nitrogen and chlorine have a value of 3.0. This means that there is no electronegativity difference. So we don't draw in any arrows because these are not polar bonds. They are completely non-polar. No difference whatsoever in electronegativity values. If we don't even have polar bonds, it's impossible for this to be a polar molecule. So is NCl3 polar or not? Well, we can definitely say a resounding no, it is not polar. If we consider carbon tetrachloride, remember that this molecule would have a tetrahedral shape. All of these ends are chlorine, so although their value is 3.0 and carbon is 2.5, we see all of the ends are chlorine, so they're all slightly negative ends. So we can definitely see that with all ends being negative, it's impossible for this to be a polar molecule, even though it contains slightly polar bonds, because the carbon is not an end. It's at the center of the molecule. It's not sticking out to it as an end. It's not sticking out towards the outside. It's stuck on the inside. And that makes all ends negative and the carbon that's inside positive. So this is a non-polar molecule, even though it contains polar bonds. They end up canceling each other out as one way to look at it, or all ends are negative is another way of saying it can't be a dipole because there's only negative ends. Where's the other pole? If we looked at a slightly different molecule, CHCl3, essentially what we've done is replace one of those chlorines with hydrogen. Then we still have arrows going from carbon out towards each of those chlorines in the base, but we have an arrow going from the hydrogen towards the carbon, a very short arrow because it's almost nonpolar. It's in the nonpolar region, 0.4 difference. Just slight difference of 0.4. So it would have a very small arrow pointing from hydrogen towards carbon, and then arrows going out from the carbon towards each of those green ends, the chlorines. So overall, we would have the hydrogen end as slightly positive, and all three of those chlorine ends are slightly negative. So this molecule that's shaped the same as the other, because of replacing a chlorine with a hydrogen, we definitely get a polar molecule out of this. This is a dipole that exists. So we could draw an arrow out to the side of this molecule that goes from the hydrogen end towards the base of the molecule, the chlorine ends. Polarity does affect the properties, polarity of a molecule. Polar molecules will be attracted to each other and to any other polar or even ionic substances. And this helps to explain why some molecular substances will melt at much higher temperatures than others due to attraction between separate molecules due to these partially charged ends. It also explains why N2, O2, and CO2, which are nonpolar molecules, are gases even at room temperature, while water, a polar substance, is a liquid at room temperature due to these attractions between separate particles. It also explains why some substances will dissolve in water while other substances will not. Our general rule is like dissolves like. So polar molecules will dissolve in other polar substances. Nonpolar molecules will dissolve in other nonpolar substances. There are a few molecular substances that either have extremely high melting points or they may not even melt at all. When they get really hot, before they melt, it becomes hot enough to break the bonds between particles, so they would decompose instead of melting. Now these are known as network solids. Very stable substances may exist as network solids, where all of the atoms are covalently bonded to their neighbors. And there are not individual molecules, there are not discrete particles to identify here. The entire sample, such as this diamond in the lower right-hand corner, consists of one giant molecular solid that is one giant molecule of pure carbon. Every carbon in that diamond is connected to 4 other carbons. The only exception to this is right out at the very edge of the diamond. Then obviously that pattern stops. Now silicon can also bond up to 4 times. Notice silicon is also in the same family as carbon. So they both have the ability to form 4 bonds. And silicon carbide is another network solid that can be artificially created. It consists of equal amounts of silicon and carbon in alternating layers, as can be seen in this diagram on the right. Now silicon carbide has a melting point of about 2,700 degrees Celsius, and it's so hard that it's used in grindstones and used as an abrasive. Diamond and silicon carbide samples are essentially huge single molecules, and they're extremely hard, both of them. However, diamond is naturally occurring and silicon carbide is man-made. This table emphasizes differences in the characteristics of ionic compounds versus covalently bonded compounds. Take some time to look this over. I hope you found this video to be informative, and there are 2 others in this sequence on 8.4, so be sure to watch those next.